Recommended by Who Do You Think You Are magazine and featured on BBC Radio.
Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. Here's your presenter, Malcolm Noble.
Hello everyone, thank you for being there and welcome to episode 31 of the Talk Genealogy podcast. We call it the monthly podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. What have you been up to? I made the mistake of taking the history of an old Yorkshire house off the shelf in my bookshop. It has no connection with my family, but I'm just a sucker for it. It's one of those privately published books from the 1920s that they're just time eaters. That's what it is. Idling. I've been idling, wasting my time. What else? Well, I've had a digital copy of a bundle of Menorah records. I say a bundle, about half a dozen leaves. And I've been working at transcribing them. I threw in one Latin document just for good measure, but I'm getting there bit by bit, and it always helps, that these old documents do have common sort of formulaic phrases that you can pick out and they help you get started. But it is so infuriating when the margins are discoloured or so faded that no tricks of light can bring them back to life, well, not in my library at home at least. So there's that painful lesson again. The evidence is just no longer there. It's gone. It's lost to history. This month our subject is the Churchwardens of Old England. I want to look at the history of the post very briefly, the work that they did and the value of the Churchwardens' accounts and records for the modern genealogist. I guess that their potential was first highlighted by the Victorian historian Charles Cox, who produced a neither here nor there book on them in the later years of the 19th century. Regular listeners may have picked up that I'm not a great lover of Cox's work in particular. I can be rather put off by his habit of criticising his colleagues in print. But hey, the book on Churchwardens' account is okay as a taster, and I've quoted from it in this episode. But I want this episode to go a little further than this is what they are and this is where you'll find them. I hope to use the relationship between the warden and the physical village to emphasise the benefits of linking two different strands of research. Finding that your ancestor authorised payment to a church carpenter is only half the job. A knowledge of church history can show you what he would have been working on, and connecting those two pieces of evidence, well, it's very much like the old saying, isn't it? The whole is greater than the sum of the two parts. So that's what this evening is about. But first, I want to remind you that I'm neither a professional nor an expert. I'm an enthusiast like you, who has spent more than 50 years digging up his family tree, often in the wrong place. And these podcasts, well, really, they're no more than me sharing with you some of the lessons that I've learned on the way. And as always, I need to emphasise, I am talking about ancestor hunting in England. As soon as I've attached a new name to the far reaches of my family tree, I'm looking for scraps of information that will tell me something about their lives, how they spent their day. And spotting that one of them was a church warden is always rewarding, but not simply because we can look into some of the things that they were involved with, but better still, some of the fruits of their labours, the decisions they made, projects that they supported, might still be on show in the church, especially in the fabric. And so, in this month's podcast, I thought we'd look at how church wardens were appointed and what they did so that we can relate them to what was going on in the parish church during their tenure. And I'm talking Old England here. The scope and to some extent the authority of church wardens in England changed very much in 1921. So my comments tonight really concern generations before then. Although I am always tickled by the Agatha Christie portrait in the early chapters of Murder in the Vicarage, written in 1930, of the tensions between the vicar and his warden. So perhaps the dynamics took just a little longer to change, even if they ever did. I look at it like this. If the vicar is the captain of the ship, then the churchwarden and his sidemen are the Marines. They bring any disorder or neglect to the notice of their bishop. And that is perhaps the key to understanding the world of churchwardens. They were the bishop's men, and women in more cases than you might expect. And they were accountable to him, and that immediately introduces scope for niggles and falling out in the parish. Great stuff, isn't it? The office of the churchwarden can be traced back to 1127. In 1341, they were described as wardens of the goods of the church, including the fabric of the church itself. But from an early age, they were responsible for the presentment, and that means to the bishop, probably through an ecclesiastical court, of any moral delinquencies either in the clergy or the laity of the parish. We can see that the churchwarden was responsible for monitoring expenditure. This extended to overseeing income and expenditure, eventually of all church affairs in the parish, not simply in the church and the churchyard. Remember, many churches at this time managed livestock. While much expenditure needed the formal authority of the bishop, it was the churchwarden who guarded the purse strings. And in his book, which is post-1921, on keeping church accounts, Slade gives a more detailed overview of their other traditional tasks. 1. Maintaining order in church and in the churchyard, but they must not interfere with the order of the service. 2. Arranging for the seating of parishioners in the church. 3. Providing the necessary church furniture and the parochial registers. 4. Protecting the church property by action if necessary, and generally acting as guardians of the interests of the church against all forms of wrongdoing. 5. The churchwardens are the proper officers to make collections at other services and to take part in collection of alms. And 6. Acting as sequestrators, if so required, during a vacancy in the living, and in this capacity arranging for the performance of Sunday services and for the maintenance of the beneficed property. And there is also a rather informal status of being the ordinary link between the parish and the bishop, and some sources make much of this. The breadth of the churchwarden's duties expanded with the dissolution of the monasteries, the Tudor Poor Laws, and the emergence of the vestry as the fulcrum of local government. Now, you may remember in episode 11 of these podcasts, we looked at how the vestry took over the role and status of the manorial and 100 courts at this time, and the churchwarden was often the power within the vestry. So I do want to refer you back to that episode 11, which looked at that increasing power and how the different roles sometimes overlapped and the idiosyncratic nature of the respective records. The recording of that episode is still available through our website, talkgenealogy.blog. The churchwarden's duties became so broad that a couple of sidemen were often appointed in each parish to assist him. Now, here is a tongue-in-cheek specification of the sideman's job, and I've taken this from Cox's book. It relates to the parish registers of Chidwell in Lancashire. So what's the job of a sideman? To ken and see and say nought, to eat and drink and pay nought, and when the wardens drunken roam, your duty is to see them home. However, it's wrong to think of any uniform pattern across the country. Commonly, 2 wardens would be appointed, with 1 or 2 sidemen. Sometimes they were called high wardens and junior wardens. Some parishes went as far as 4 wardens, and some made a point of including a female. As I say, we can't really point to common patterns. talkgenealogy.blog Here is the website that supports the monthly podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. You'll find links to previous episodes, a full list of books mentioned in the series, one or two details about other genealogy work I've done, and every now and then, though more then than now, a bit of a blog.
Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
It was a principle that the parish elected or chose the warden, not the incumbent. However, this had weakened by Victorian times. In 1571 it was held that the churchwardens, depending on the customs in their particular parishes, should be chosen by votes of the parishioners and the ministers. In 1603 it was said that all churchwardens in every parish should be chosen by the joint consent of the minister and the parishioners, if that can be achieved. But if they couldn't agree on such a choice, then the minister should choose one and the parishioners another. However, I do think that we should recognise that the authorities were trying to maintain the idea that the warden was someone drawn up from and by the folk of the village. Now, just a word here, we should not confuse the churchwarden with the parish clerk of this time. The distinction is especially important when we're talking about parish clerks in centuries gone by. The parish clerk post-1921 became a very different animal, the old and venerated post having declined in the 19th century. Like the churchwarden, the parish clerk was a very ancient post, but his status was very different. Normally, the appointment was in the gift of the incumbent. It was for life. It was more involved in the management of services, and it came with a freehold property. Churchwardens got nothing like that. But we do need to be especially wary where we find the signature of a church clerk, especially later on. Usually a simple background check in the parish registers will unburden the truth, and we'll be able to sort out if they were the churchwarden or not. We can see that the churchwarden's job was expanding and drawing in greater potential for conflict. Instead of merely being concerned with the good order of the church, the warden now had some, at least, responsibility for charity in the parish, as well as an intricate involvement in the vestry. So people became increasingly reluctant to do the job. You know, it's easy to imagine that the role would attract the village feisty, who would always like to feel he had a battle on his hands. By 1557 we can find an example where wardens were appointed for 2 years, and there was a fine of 13 4d if they refused the appointment. Through the records of the churchwardens, we'll be able to find many instances of relief or charity, and entries about curious and unusual people who passed through the parish, the dates of visitations, perhaps confirmation that bells had been rung as instructed. But always, the most interesting to me is the evidence of work being done on the church fabric, because that work might still be found. This is the sort of connection that you can find through the churchwarden's accounts. Paid to Mellor, the joiner, in part payment for £4 6 shillings and 8d for the making of the close in the new chapel. Paid to Harry Hawthorne for timber workmanship and for the boarding of his men. For 42 feet of board for the south window in the steeple when the bell was taken out and in, and 100½ nails, 11 shillings and 6d. To Robert the carpenter for taking down of the steeple and to cover it again. In these circumstances, we can imagine our ancestor looking at or inspecting the work being done.
Here's some earlier episodes of the podcast. Episode 15. Let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs. Episode 13 was about the hearth tax. Episode 12, and it was Shakespeare, for example. Episode 9 discussed the medieval pipe rolls. Go to episode 7 for the companions of William the Conqueror. Episode 2, the Herald's Visitations, and our very first episode looked at working with Tudor wills. Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Now, every month, as you know, we like to revisit a past episode of this series, and this evening I'd like to lend an ear to episode 19 on the life and work of the genealogist William Phillimore. The recording is still available, so let's listen to what was going on. Show us that Phillimore was working on a completely different level. He began to campaign for the establishment of local record officers. As he turned 40, he commenced on an even more ambitious project: the transcription and publication of marriage registers across England. In 1896, Phillimore was involved in probably the most colourful aspect of his career, a scandalous case which brought him for a few months a degree of popular notice, if not fame, well beyond the normal scope of its colleagues. As I say, that episode is still there. You can access it through talkgenealogy.blog.
Building an audio library with Malcolm Noble.
Now, where to find the Churchwardens' accounts? First thing, it does all depend on chance, and in many parishes, none of these documents have survived. Also, any records that you do find are likely to vary not only in their scope, but also in their style. Some may be simple lists of expenditure and tasks completed, while others can include comments about the people and topics around the parish, or even around the vestry table. So it is worth a look. Now, okay, a quick look through the discovery plane of the National Archives, through their website, followed by an inquiry at the relevant county records office. There are published transcripts. You should be able to find out details of these through the relevant Family History Society, the Society of Genealogists, or a word at the desk of your local studies section in the relevant public library. Now, these are the sort of documents that have often been transcribed by the Record Society of the relevant county, so check their list. And those 3 pointers show you how worthwhile it is getting to know the local history literature for areas that you're interested in. That may seem like a lot of homework, but you will be well rewarded. When, rather than if, you find that your ancestor was a churchwarden, search the church history for any work done or matters debated at the time, and you will find a link with their daily lives, but it is not always quite that straightforward. Now, not in a church account, but in a will, a Tudor ancestor of mine left money for mending being completed in the church at the time of his will and his subsequent death. Of course, I want to find out what that work was, and if he survives, I want to look at the thing that occupied his mind in those last days. It's probably the only personal link I've got with an ancestor who lived more than 500 years ago. And you know, I think we should always adopt this as the objective, the next step after we've found an appropriate entry in the Churchwarden's account is to go and look for the evidence. We want to look at the work which our ancestor was trekking on, talking about, concerned about, authorising. It occupied them. So how do we work out what Harry Hawthorne the carpenter was doing, and is it still there to see? Well, at least we have got an exact date of payment. So let's start with the obvious and most accessible sources, the architectural guides for the county. The church history, now this may be no more than a leaflet, but they're likely to be different revisions and additions, so dig a bit deeper. The early one may include a comment omitted by subsequent editors. Also check the archives of the provincial newspapers. Any articles on the church may refer to old works. And if you're lucky, the diocese may have a website telling the stories of their different churches. But it's likely that you're looking for quite detailed information, work completed in a particular year. And while all that reading is good background and it is important, you're going to need a visit to the church. And if you're researching from overseas, then really this is one of those occasions when you would need someone to visit on your behalf. And please, do end up talking to someone who knows what they and you are talking about. I've not come across a church without an enthusiast who knows more about the place than has ever been written down. Now, why not start there, you might say, before you do all this burrowing around in books? The answer is because you will get a more helpful response if you're able to show that you've put some hours into the project, that you aren't looking for a free ride. And finally, if you can get there, if you can find some evidence of the work that your ancestor was authorizing and interested in, I think these are the golden moments of ancestor hunting. You might know little more about him than his name and with luck the years that he was born and died. But here we are, 400 or 500 years on, looking at a piece of work that he looked at, that he observed. And now we're doing it. It makes you as chuffed as old Henry. I've written myself a book. Hello everyone, I'm taking time out to support the release of my history about the plague in a Nottinghamshire village in 1604. In 1604, the Trentside village of Bleasby in Nottinghamshire was hit by the bubonic plague. It took off 100, give or take a soul or two, from a population that was, best guess, a touch over 300. The plague in Bleasby, a Nottinghamshire village, survives its summer of death. You'll find out more about it at plagueinbleasby.com. Thank you for listening to episode 31 of the Talk Genealogy podcast. We've been talking about the work and records of the Churchwardens of Old England. Please get in touch if you have any thoughts or comments. The next episode will be posted at 7:30 p.m. UK time on the 3rd of December. Hey, that's part of the Christmas countdown. My thanks as always go to Freeze Effects for the music, Emily Brooks for the voiceover, and most of all, thank you for listening. It really does make a difference. Good night, and God bless. Any questions or comments? Any ideas or suggestions? You can contact the podcast through the website talkgenealogy.blog or through the Facebook page. And there's Twitter, of course. On social media, just search for Talk Genealogy.
MalcolmNoble.com